It's Monday morning, and Norman Normal is having breakfast, a nice cup of tea and a boiled egg. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. It was Mr. Shitsack from the Conservative and Unionist Party, and he very much would like Norman to vote for him in the upcoming elections. Norman isn't sure. He's heard all these promises before. Tuesday morning, Norman is having a bacon sandwich with a lovely cup of tea. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Who could this be? Norman wondered. It was Smear Stomer from the Labour Party. He said, everything was the Conservatives' fault, and the Labour Party would do everything differently. Even though all the policies sounded exactly the same, Norman isn't sure. He's heard all these promises before. It's Wednesday morning, a beautiful sunny day. The birds are singing and the sun is shining. Norman is having cornflakes for breakfast. Suddenly, there is a knock on the door. Who on earth is that? Said Norman. He was getting fed up with the repetition and lazy animation. It was Dead Wavy from the Liberal Democrats. He said everything was the Conservative and Labour Party's fault, and they would do everything differently, even though his policies sounded exactly the same. He would like Norman to vote for him. Norman isn't sure. He's heard all these promises before. Norman is very cross. His cup of tea has gone cold, and he realizes that all the political parties are exactly the same. They represent big business and the military-industrial complex, and not the people who vote them in to represent them. If only there was a way to tell them we don't want any of them. Norman doesn't know what to do, so he turns on the radio, makes another cup of tea, and sits at the kitchen table when a little song comes on.
If you are feeling dispossessed, wondering what course of action is best, here's a worthy note. Go ahead and spoil your vote and write upon it, I do not consent. Every vote is counted, you see. It's a right that's been bequeathed to you and me, Tory, Labour, Liberals and Greens. Don't understand what this means. Removing them from power is easier than it seems. The majority of people do not vote. Tacit agreement from the most. If they exercised their right, there's no need to stand and fight. We can remove the parasites from the host.
It's Thursday morning, it's raining and gloomy, it's voting day, and Norman knows exactly what to do. For the first time in his life, Norman was going to spoil his ballot and write across it, I do not consent. Norman leaves the house and sets out on the short walk to the voting station. Something amazing happened. Hundreds of people were doing the same thing, leaving the house to show the political class that we no longer have faith in them and spoil their ballot. People who had stopped voting years ago turned up to write, I do not consent on their ballot. Mr. Normal wrote, I do not consent. Mr. Farmer wrote, I do not consent. Mr. Inner City Violence wrote, I do not consent. Mr. Ex-Veteran wrote, I do not consent. Little Miss Nurse wrote, I do not consent. And so did everyone in the town. Jubilant Mr. Normal returned home, made a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen table to wait for the result. A little after midnight, the news came in. In a free and fair election, I do not consent has it. I repeat, I do not consent has it. Everybody in Happy Town was over the moon. It turned out that everyone in the country had voted the same way. And that's the end of our story from me and Mr. Normal. Goodbye. Please look out for our next story. Mr. King has a constitutional crisis. Coming soon. Mr. King's constitutional crisis. Mr. King was having a lovely day. He was having kippers for breakfast that had been flown in especially for him from the Isle of Mr. Man. As he ate, he worried about climate change and how he and his best friend, Mr. Scab, could marshal a plan to stop it. Mr. King didn't like to make decisions himself. He found it far easier to hand the decision-making over to foreign billionaires with transhumanist ideas. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. It was Mr. Shitsack from the Conservative and Unionist Party, and he looked worried. "Why does one look so worried, Mr. Shitsack?" asked Mr. King. "Oh, it's terrible, Mr. King," said Mr. Shitsack. "We had a general election yesterday, and it didn't go the way me or Mr. Stomer planned it." "Does one still allow them to vote?" Mr. King asked, confused. "Well, we pretend to," said Mr. Shitsack. "We have convinced most of the general population not to bother. They think it's a waste of time." "Well, that's fantastic," said Mr. King. "Thank you for keeping one up to date." "No, Your Highness, you don't understand. Yesterday they did bother to vote, and they didn't vote for the Uni Party." "Who did those people vote for?" asked Mr. King. "No one," said Mr. Shitsack. "They wrote on the ballot that they do not consent." "And is that a problem?" asked Mr. King. "Of course it's a problem, you sausage-fingered adulterer. We can't do anything now. We can't tax them, we can't make any laws, and we can't police them. We are fucked." Mr. King looked horrified. "Put the television on. It's all over the news," said Mr. Shitsack. "Here I am in Happy Town, talking to Norman Normal. He is one of the people who spoiled their ballot and voted I do not consent. Mr. Normal, why did you vote I do not consent?" "In a world where politics reign supreme and our leaders strut about like peacocks, there's a little thing called voting. But some folks have had enough of the same old song and dance, the same lies and broken promises. So they are shouting from the rooftops, 'I do not consent,' and causing quite a stir." "So what didn't you consent to?" "You see, Parliament thinks it's the big cheese, declaring itself sovereign and all. But hold your horses. The real bosses are normal people like me, and we're not afraid to show it. By not voting, you're basically saying, 'I'm cool with whatever you lot decide.' Wouldn't it be better not to vote then, and just stay at home, instead of causing all these constitutional issues? Some reckon staying at home on election day is the way forward. But let me tell you, that's like letting a bunch of chimps run the zoo. You want change, you got to get in the ring and throw your punches." "You sound like a right-wing extremist, Mr. Normal, are you?" "Don't you dare try to brand me like that. I don't care if you're male, female, straight, gay, black, white, or any color of the rainbow. My best friend is orange." "You do sound anti-monarchy." "I'm all for the monarchy when they are doing the job they should be doing, instead of behaving like some lame Disney World tourist attraction. They are there to uphold the people's rights under the Constitution." "Don't you feel bad for causing all these problems for Mr. King?" "Listen, I have a message for Mr. King. If you don't want to do your job and look after the people's rights and uphold the Constitution, f*** off." Mr. King was shocked, and he didn't know what to do. He spent that afternoon reading the Happy Land Constitution and was overjoyed to see that the people in the past had a solution to his troubles. He hadn't realized that he hadn't been doing his job properly. He thought being a tourist attraction was his job, and he couldn't have been more wrong. He was amazed the people of Happy Land had put up with it for so long. So long, in fact, that it had stopped being Happy Land altogether and steadily morphed into downright miserable land. In his heart he was happy that the people had written, "I do not consent," because when he looked at it more closely, neither did he. His one job was to make sure that the people of Happy Land were indeed happy, and he set about to make that happen. Well, that's the end of this little tale, and it was the end of Mr. Shitsack and Mr. Stomer too. But that's for next time. Look out for our next story. Mr. King fixes everything.